You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 261 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I have a lot of news to cover on today's show, including the admission that we finally have now that the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. We have an attack on an event where the commander of U.S. forces for Afghanistan was present. And then we also had the Afghan elections over the weekend. So a lot of important stuff to cover. Share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or just go to the Libertarian Institute. At the Libertarian Institute, you could find this podcast as well as my daily news roundup featured on the right-hand side of that homepage there. So libertarianinstitute.org. First thing I want to talk about here is something that's gained a lot of news and attention in kind of the anti-war circle, and that is social networks purging of alternative media voices and outlets from their sites, Twitter and Facebook. Some of the sites that have gone down that you probably know the names of that sound familiar. Cop Block is a big one, although I do know that site's changed kind of in the past year or so after the original founder of that kind of site and movement had some legal trouble himself. Police the Police was another site, Anti-Media, and the Free Thought Project. I would say the most kind of common thread among all of these sites isn't necessarily a bias, for or against, Russia or any other particular issue, but mainly just a, kind of questioning of the American government's narrative about world events. This includes topics at home like Cop Block and Police the Police were really just exposing, videos where police are abusive to people. This is the kind of content that they shared, trying to make awareness that, hey, maybe every time you have a problem with your neighbor, don't call the police because sometimes the police show up and end up shooting somebody. And, there's better ways of mediation resolving your problems than police. Another thing that all these sites had in common is that they were blacklisted by the group Prop or Not, and this is a very shadowy organization that got the Washington Post to publish and write about their list. This is really right after the 2016 election, where you have Donald Trump beating Hillary Clinton, and then the Democrats desperately searching for an excuse and landing on Russia as a reason. I talked about this article that Gareth Porter wrote for Conservative News on the last show, so if you want a little bit more insight on that, check that out, and I'm going to link on this show to Scott actually interviewing Scott Horton, that is, Gareth Porter on his podcast about his work there. But basically what Gareth explains is just that the amount of posts that these alleged sites that were run by Russia actually had, that their influence was very, very minor. And so, this idea that all these sites are Russia propaganda is ridiculous to start with, but even if they were, this definitely isn't the reason that Hillary Clinton lost that election. With the fact that all these websites, heavily question kind of the narrative the United States government put out, that tends to put them in the camp where they're, against the idea of the American empire and against a lot of the foreign intervention by the U.S. overseas. And so, there's really been a target along with, all this, purging by the social media sites and, either banning, shadow banning, or demonetizing. It's really hurt, the journalism and the work done by the anti-war movement. And I think a lot of people maybe will identify, well, all these places still have their websites up, and so how much is it really hurting them? But we, even an example brought up in the past on this show, Will Porter had a gig writing for the Daily Sheeple, and they had some demonetization going on, and Will was one of the people who unfortunately got cut from that. And so, you had somebody who was writing a couple articles a day, really against the American empire. And a lot of his articles are focused on what the U.S. was doing overseas. And, that gets silenced and, kind of just put out by one of these, moves by the social networking companies. On the last show, I also talked about Canada legalizing weed and how this was a great step. I also read over the weekend that Canada introduces some new legislation that's going to remove the fees associated with and the waiting periods to get a pardon for cannabis convictions in Canada. This, is another big step in a part of the drug war I didn't focus on the last show, but there are a lot of harms created by the strict government interventions to attempt to stomp out drug users and prevent drug use. And so you have an awful lot of people with unnecessary felony convictions that really makes their lives a lot more difficult. And, this is another great step Canada is taking in the right direction. Looking at the southern border, there was another migrant caravan that was headed up through Central America into the U.S., possibly originating in Honduras. And I don't know what percentage of this caravan will be Hondurans, but they were coming towards the United States. Trump, in his very, kind of Trumpian style, tweets out that, if these people make it to the U.S., he'll cut off aid to Honduras. Because Trump tweets it in such a blatant way and, really makes it about the immigration issue. So everybody's picking up on it. This one gets a lot of attention and condemnation, but it's one of those things that I think is very important to remember is that, the U.S. uses our foreign aid to bribe governments around the world in order to get them to do their people things that they don't want to do. And so in this case, there are people who want to leave and come to the United States. The American government doesn't want to have that happen. And so, Trump publicly on Twitter threatens to remove the foreign aid. I would guess typically these foreign aid decisions are, kind of made and threats are on a much lower key and not by the president of the United States. But, I just thought this was a great example of how this happens and, why it's something we should oppose. In a speech, Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world and owner of Amazon, said that Amazon will continue to contract with the Pentagon for, either cybersecurity or whatever kind of weapons needs. I've talked in the past about this show about Google's Project Maven, which was, I believe, the one where they were, using AI on drones to help identify targets. And so these ties between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon, I think will have, kind of multiple issues here. The first is just that, the Pentagon, may suggest to, some of these countries, hey, if your platforms are, selling content that is anti-U.S. wars or U.S. empire, or you're allowing your users to post content that's anti-wars, or something like this, then we might be less inclined to do business with you. And so, for that reason, you could start to see some of these companies or, like Google suppressing search results for anti-war sites if, that's something the Pentagon wants and, again, using as a bribe. But I also am guessing it's going to start to, move these companies away from being more concerned about, the products for their consumers and, towards what they could do to help design bigger and better weapons that the United States will use to kill people. So just, kind of unfortunate there. Now, it turns out the Department of Defense has a lot of problems with cybersecurity. A GAO report found that, they're way behind on securing their weapons and all this information, especially as more and more stuff moves onto the internet. And so, we could look and probably expect that the Pentagon is going to be offering bigger and bigger dollar signs to Silicon Valley and, other tech companies, to, get their, products. I read a story and, this is one of those things that is kind of like comical just because it's so stupid, but that, there's an Air Force base that spent $326,000 over a couple-year period on about 391 cups. I guess these are like self-warming coffee mugs or something ridiculous like that. But they had to buy a ton of them because every time they're dropped, the handle breaks and falls off, and it's a real problem. And so this is an example of just the kind of abuse that the government has and why, these companies want the contracts. And as the government tends, and especially the Department of Defense, to just throw money around. So they're willing to drop $300,000 on 400 coffee cups. Imagine what they're willing to drop on a program that's going to at least even, just report it, and contract it to be something that defends America's weapons security. In reality, it may not do that. There's a pretty good article by John Kiriakou out in Consortium News. I'm going to link to this one on the show notes page about the persecution that whistleblowers in the United States face and how, rather than being celebrated as heroes for kind of going out on a limb and, saying, hey, American people, the government is wasting or abusing their powers right here. These people are typically shunned. Their careers are damaged, if not ended completely. You have, Julian Assange living in exile and Edward Snowden as well. But in Kiriakou's article, he outlines the case of this guy. I believe his name is Darren Jones. And he worked for the FBI, and I guess the FBI contracted, and the guy at the FBI, who was on point for signing the contracts and everything, pretty much immediately after the contract is signed, goes and works for the company that he contracted with. And so there's laws around this that say that this isn't allowed, and Mr. Jones here points that out and then gets fired. And so, there's actually laws that are supposed to be there to protect whistleblowers, but the FBI just said that they're going to ignore them. And that's the situation for this poor man who just tried to expose some, possible waste and corruption going on in the government. And I think, this is why, again, that you have these massive contracts, and people, losing money or buying stupid broken products and spending way too much on them. Is just because anybody who's going to say anything about it will either, be fired or demoted and stuff like this. All right, so Jamal Khashoggi here, Saudi Arabia admits that he was killed. They have detained 18 people and dismissed a couple other from their posts. Two of the people dismissed from their posts and who seem to be getting the blame from the Saudi government are top advisors to Mohammed bin Salman, and the narrative from Saudi Arabia is that Mohammed bin Salman knows nothing about this. The Saudis don't say that he was intentionally executed, just that a fight broke out between this guy and I guess the 15 other people there, and Khashoggi, a 60-year-old man, was on the wrong end of that. It seems pretty clear to me that if he was killed in there, that this was without a doubt a murder. There's still reports going around that there's some audio and possibly video of this murder. I still haven't seen anything or any actual reporting saying that, journalists have seen this audio or video. I know I've said this on the past couple shows, but I really mean it. Within the next week or so, I will have an article really detailing the whole timeline here, what happened, who Jamal Khashoggi was, and, possibly what had happened and who knew and everything like that. But we're still just getting a trickle of information now. All the information we're getting are coming from government sources, Saudi Arabia, the United States, or Turkey. And for that reason, I think it's really hard to try to, possibly even sniff out what is true. And I think it's going to be a couple weeks before we get some really good journalism in on this, and then we can really break down what's happening. But, for now, I could just give you the details that the governments are putting out. But no matter what, now that Jamal Khashoggi is dead, something has to be, done here. There has to be real repercussions for Saudi Arabia, even if the balance of power in the Middle East doesn't necessarily shift and the fundamental alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia goes unchanged. Saudi Arabia will certainly have to make some kind of repairs to relationships with Turkey and the United States here. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. Just as another note, the U.S. ambassador, the Saudi ambassador to the U.S., Prince Khalid, who is another son of the King of Saudi Arabia, Solomon, and the younger brother to the Crown Prince, Prince Mohammed, has been recalled back to the Saudi Arabia and will not be returning to the United States. One of the reasons this Khashoggi murder is probably such a big deal when you've had Saudi Arabia and other countries, commit worse crimes against journalists all the time, and Saudi Arabia is certainly doing worse things against Yemen than than the single Khashoggi murder. But it's probably because, for most things, the money that Saudi Arabia uses to, either funnel into countries and pay off lobbyists. There's a very good interview out by the Scott Horton Show. I'll link to this one in the show notes page as well, about the Saudi lobby in the United States, but they also buy weapons from tons of companies around the world, and so they have all this influence. They're even the second largest weapons purchaser from Germany after Algeria. So it's very important to keep in mind that while it does seem like now the momentum is for the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States to start to break apart, that there's a lot of money interest between Saudi Arabia and the United States and other Western countries buying our weapons. That's definitely going to be a driving factor to, make some small repairs by Saudi Arabia, but continue on with this relationship. The U.S. asked the UN to look at ending the UN mission to Kosovo. I know this has been going on since about 1999. I'm not really familiar with many other, details about this mission, but it is something that I'm sure if it develops and the UN does start to look to exit. I know Russia has some interest in Kosovo, and so it'll probably be a fairly important geopolitical issue. Macedonia's parliament approved a resolution, I believe a constitutional change that's going on here to change the name of the country. There's 3 votes that this has to go through. It passed the first vote. I believe the third vote will be the real sticking point since it'll require a 2/3 majority vote. It seems a rather trivial thing to talk about a country changing its name or not. However, this name change means that Greece will remove their standing veto against Macedonia joining NATO, and we'll have another state within the NATO alliance. Max Blumenthal wrote a pretty interesting article on Nikki Haley's speech he attended. In the article, Haley talked about how she played up this idea that Trump was some crazy madman, and I believe even told the Chinese that if they didn't go along with increasing pressure against, I guess more sanctions on North Korea, that Donald Trump was, so reckless that he might actually go and attack the North Koreans. Probably not the greatest strategy that you'd like to see being played out, where you have your diplomats around the world telling other countries that our president's crazy and may do anything, because, this may make them fear that, well, if he'll do anything, what about a nuclear war or something like that? Nikki Haley says she told Donald Trump, that this is what she was doing and that he absolutely loved it. This isn't a surprise to me. He seems like the kind of guy that doesn't mind being feared. She did say one of the times that she urged Donald Trump back, so, threatening to invade North Korea, threatening the Chinese to invade North Korea was, just good politics, but Donald Trump calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man, she said, crossed the line of, the expected decorum at the UN and protested that, although she, I guess, somewhat admits that, Donald Trump achieved his end with that. Haley said that she was initially offered the Secretary of State job and didn't take it, and then was offered the U.S. ambassador to the UN job. She sought out, famed foreign policy grandmaster Henry Kissinger to be her mentor, made a list of demands to Donald Trump, including, not being a figurehead or a spokeswoman, but making her own decisions, and, generally asking for more power and to be on more councils and seats than the national security advisor is typically on. Haley turns out to be a real hawk here, and I think very much against Trump's, his vision of U.S. foreign policy, very much against Assad and looking for regime change in Syria. Again, at least her statements to the Chinese and, in general about North Korea were very hawkish against Iran as well, and completely dismissive of the, massacre of the Palestinian people. In Syria, along the Euphrates Valley, south of the city of Deir ez-Zor, you have ISIS continuing control a large stretch of land there. In the past, 5.5 months, the United States has only taken about, and their Kurdish-backed forces, about 5 square miles of that territory. And there's been quite a few ISIS counterattacks, including the kidnapping of a bunch of refugees living in a camp there. And now they're threatening either if they're not delivered food, they're going to kill 10 of these hostages a day. I really haven't seen an explanation from the U.S. government why they've halted so much and really haven't pushed to take back this territory from ISIS. we've seen in the past where they're willing to pretty much flatten cities. And, these are small villages and towns, not large cities like Raqqa or Kobani, which they've been very willing to just flatten to kill ISIS. And so it's very interesting that they've been so slow in retaking this territory. Part of it could be is that if, ISIS is completely wiped off the map in Syria, it's going to be a lot harder to justify to most Americans the U.S. deployment of troops there. Although the Trump administration has been working very hard to shift the narrative that we don't need to be in Syria to fight ISIS, but then to fight Iranian or Russian influence within Syria. The U.S. airstrikes that have gone on in this territory during this time haven't gone particularly well. We recently had 6 SDF forces, which are mainly American-backed Kurdish forces, although in this area they could have been Arab forces that were killed by a U.S. airstrike. We also had 32 civilians over the weekend killed by a U.S. airstrike. All right, moving on to Afghanistan, and this is where we'll wrap up the show. We had on Thursday in Afghanistan an attack on the commander of U.S. forces to Afghanistan, General Miller. He was about to leave a conference, so it was he was there, the governor of the Kandahar province, and then the police chief and the top intelligence official of the Kandahar province. Both of these guys are very important generals in high-ranking member of the Afghan armed forces. A gunman who was dressed in Afghan military uniform. I'm not sure if he was actually an enlisted undercover soldier, or maybe he just stole the uniform the day before. Either way, we had this green attack in some parts, but green on blue attack as, this guy takes and then shoots the Kandahar governor, police chief, and top intelligence official. And there are reports that the U.S. General Miller actually took a bullet as well, but his body armor protected him. 2 other U.S. service members were injured in this attack. It seems for the most part this has been downplayed by the U.S. government. Here you have an attack on the top U.S. military person in Afghanistan, and it's received pretty little news attention. So I've been surprised by that, and they kind of gotten away with that. This war seems to be going extremely poorly, and this seems to be another sign that, Trump would maybe pick on that, man, if we can't even, keep our own military generals safe in Afghanistan, maybe it's time for the U.S. military to just not be there at all. This will have some other implications. These Afghan military officials that were killed had a reputation for being very successful and very brutal to the people of Kandahar in order to try to suppress the Taliban there. And the Kandahar governor who actually lived through this attack is now in the hospital. It's resulted, the Afghan parliamentary elections were over the weekend. However, this attack has postponed the Kandahar voting for a week. Overall, the Afghani elections were a pretty bloody affair. 36 people killed, 193 potential attacks occurred on polling stations. Lines were very long, but that doesn't necessarily seem because of high turnout. More likely it was because they had these new biometric machines. There were a certain number of people trained on them, but those people were threatened and many of them didn't show up for work. And so many polling stations were forced to stay open 5 or so hours past the amount of time they should have been closed. Some were going to reopen on Sunday. And again, you had the delay in voting not only in Kandahar, but also in the Ghazni province. I think one of the big problems that you're going to have with, all these attacks, the violence, the delay, the problems with the machines is going to make people feel less comfortable about the results of the election, whether this is, the actual outcome or somehow distorted. And so, I think this could just result in more violence for Afghanistan, and it probably isn't going to be the final solution that lets the Afghan government that everybody could be happy with and support and, start to move Afghanistan more towards a Western style democracy. I think it's pretty clear by now that the nation building effort in that country is a complete failure. I mean, on election day now, you have 36 people dying, and a couple days before the election, you have an attack on the top U.S. military official there. There's many areas of that country that are not very secure. Leading up to these elections, you had at least 10 candidates killed. And so while they, tout the number of Afghani women who are candidates on these ballots, I don't think it's, representative of a nation state, a Western style nation state being built in Afghanistan. All right. If you want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org for all my work. You can also check out my website, Immersion News. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. Facebook, you check out the Libertarian Union. If you really like the show and you really want to support it, make a donation. Foreign Policy Focus is on Patreon, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.